Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear participants, welcome to the second İSİFAM Ramadan talks. Today, we are going to have a talk with Dr. Salman Ahmed Shaikh on the role of Zakah in sustainable development. Before I invite Dr. Salman, I'd like to give a brief introduction about İSİFAM. Istanbul University Center for Islamic Economics and Finance, in Turkish abbreviation İSİFAM, aims to develop a sound understanding for the genuine perspective that Islam brought to all economic activities and to organize activities for the implementation of this understanding. Our center was established by the faculty members from Istanbul University who had in-depth interest in this field. The center is based on multidisciplinary manner, as it includes academicians from the Faculty of Economics, Theology, and Business Administration. We basically aim to contribute the development of theory and practice of Islamic economics and finance, realizing the effectiveness and efficiency in the industry and increasing the awareness and consciousness of the society in this regard. Our main activities include various academic and industrial studies, projects, education, training, and meetings to realize the goals briefly mentioned above. Our center is in a sense functions as an information and proposal provider to all stakeholders of the system, including the regulatory bodies, financial institutions, investors, entrepreneurs, and academia. These activities are realized in close cooperation with the Department of Islamic Economics and Finance at Istanbul University. Now, I would like to introduce about our guest. Dr. Salman is an assistant professor of finance at Shahid Zulfikar Ali Bhutto Institute of Science and Technology in Karachi and heads finance faculty cluster. He holds PhD in economics from National University of Malaysia. He also did masters in economics from Institute of Business Administration, Karachi. He has published several papers and book chapters on Islamic economics. He has recently co-authored a textbook on Islamic banking with Professor Kabir Hassan. He has presented in international conferences on Islamic economics in Turkey, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and Pakistan. He is a recipient of 2 Emerald Highly Commended Paper Awards in 2018. He's also on editorial board of 3 international journals. He has worked as a research consultant for ADB, Bankers Academy USA, United States Institute of Peace USA, EdBiz Consulting UK, and Center for Business Research, IBA. Dear participants, please join me in welcoming Dr. Salman Ahmed Shaikh to deliver his talk on the role of Zakah in sustainable development. So I'd like to hand over the chance to Dr. Salman to begin his talk. Thank you.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone who has joined for this session. First of all, I would like to thank Istanbul University Center for Islamic Economics for inviting me to share some thoughts on this topic, role of Zakat in sustainable development. So I would like to give a brief talk of about 40 to 45 minutes on this title of the topic, role of Zakat in sustainable development, and then we could discuss a few things in the Q&A. So just to focus my thoughts, I would like to present my slides as well, so that participants can also follow the different thoughts. So this talk is about Zakat and its role in the sustainable development. So basically, I would be discussing, first of all, how neoclassical economics approach the issue of altruism and also of redistribution of resources. What are the different limitations that we find in that approach? And then we are going to look at what is the Islamic approach towards issues of economics in the society. And then we are going to look at specifically the role of Zakat in the Islamic economics framework, and in facilitating the achievement of sustainable development goals. And then we are also going to look at how zakat fits into the Islamic circular flow of economy. And then finally, I would discuss brief empirical estimation of zakat in different OIC countries, a work which I did some time back, and it was also presented in Turkey in one of the conferences organized by Islamic Economy Workshop. So first of all, let me start with the neoclassical economics approach to altruism. So when we look at the issue of altruism in neoclassical economics, we find that neoclassical economics does not incorporate the phenomena of altruism. It thinks that altruism is impure. Altruism is not a pure activity. It looks at altruism as an economic activity in the self-interested paradigm. So when we look at neoclassical economics foundations, we come across this notion that resources are scarce and we have unlimited wants. And when we talk about wants, we jumble up not only the essential needs, but also all kinds of wants which are not necessarily essential. So economics does not distinguish between needs and wants, and then it says that resources are scarce for needs as well as wants. But if we look at the empirical facts, we find that food per capita availability has actually increased in the last 50 years or so. So the amount of food that is available per capita, despite the increase in population, has been growing. So the issue is not with the absolute amount of resources and their shortage. The issue is with the redistribution. So for instance, if we have 600 million poor people who are extremely poor and who are not able to feed themselves, if we are to give them $1 a day, we would require $600 million daily to feed every poor person that lives on this planet. But still we find that about $2.75 billion value of food is wasted every day. So the issue is not with the availability of resources, it is with the redistribution of resources, it is with the uh, wide distribution of resources, which does not happen because of wastage, because of wealth concentration. And we would later on look at how zakat redistributes resources from the haves to the have-nots. But looking at it from the neoclassical perspective, we find this amazing thing that the facts say something else, whereas we have a normative foundation which incorporates the idea of scarcity even in the case of needs. And then when we look at how we model economic behavior in neoclassical economics, what we find is that neoclassical economics think that uh, people pursue selfish self-interest in economic models. And we have the assumptions like monotonicity, which says that more is always better than less. If you have unlimited wants and if you have limited resources, the best way to go about is to use all your resources on your own self consumption and do not think about others, do not think about altruism. Altruism should be nonsense in neoclassical economics. Now some economists do incorporate altruism, but they incorporate it as a economic activity, as a economic choice. So they think that altruism is impure, it's just a way to uh, pursue self-interest, it's just a way to like being thanked, like people saying good uh, things about you. So altruism is looked at in a way that people are basically pursuing their self-interest and they want to have respect, they want to have warm feeling, they want to satisfy their ego, they want to improve their social image, they want to have fame that they are the most prominent donor, and they want to do it because they want to have social insurance, they want to avoid bad from people, that is why they help them. Now this foundation of altruism is quite you can say very limited. It does not incorporate the fact that people can be genuinely altruistic, people can be genuinely helping others, not because of having their own self-interest at stake or in perspective, whereas they could also engage in altruism, which is pure, which is not going to be done with a reciprocal mindset that you should get something in return if you are doing some good with others. So this is what we see in neoclassical approach. Now, if we look at the Islamic approach would look at social issues, economic issues. It would address the human being and the heart of the human being. It would include such values, norms, ethical teachings in the behavior so that people are guided towards pro-social behavior, towards sharing, towards responsibility. And it would not take such assumptions like people are selfish and they just pursue their self-interest with the limited resources that they have. Islam does not give such an approach or look at issues from such a normative approach. It has a need and objective based approach. So we come across these policy guidelines which are known as Maqasid Sharia in the Islamic jurisprudence, where there is emphasis on spirituality, on physiology, on intellect, on sustainability, and on economy. And if we are to take a broader perspective from these guidelines, what we see is that uh, protection of spirituality is, in a sense, going to inculcate values which emphasize moderation, responsibility, and justice. If we are going to emphasize on physiology, we are going to emphasize on hunger, on malnourishment, on stunting, on cleanliness, on sanitation. So, taking a broader perspective to physiology, we would incorporate the health concerns, the education concerns, the cleanliness concerns, the environmental concerns. Likewise, protection of intellect is going to focus on human capital development. Protection of sustainable livelihoods is going to talk about biodiversity, resource conservation, and having an ecosystem where all life forms can exist and live peacefully. And then the focus on economy is not going to talk about just the quantity of economic resources, but how these resources are distributed. It would emphasize on equitable distribution, on need fulfillment, on providing economic opportunities which may not result in equal resource endowments available for everyone, but it would allow need fulfillment for all. So this is the Islamic approach, which tries to look at social problems, social issues in a direct way, rather than having a normative foundation which makes it unusable or which hinder the uh, solution towards these social problems that we see exist in our real world. Now, if we look at specifically the institution of zakat in the Islamic socio-economy, first of all, what is zakat? It is a compulsory obligation in the faith of Islam to pay a certain part of surplus wealth to the specified beneficiaries every year. Zakat is levied on different forms of wealth and also on different forms of production. Now, the thing is that the person who is supposed to pay zakat has to have certain level of endowments, and the one who is going to receive zakat has to have less of those endowments. So in this way, what happens is that resources are distributed from those who have surplus endowments to those who have deficiency of endowments, and this automatically um, uh, impacts the targeted intervention, whereby the resources are flowing from those who have the surplus of those resources to those people who are having deficiency of resources, and this performs a redistribution function which does not just ignore poor or benefit the wealthy. It automatically does the redistribution from the haves to the have nots. So we are going to look at how zakat influences the redistribution in the Islamic economic framework. Now, first of all, let's look at the effect of zakat or the use of zakat as an intervention strategy in different sustainable development goals. So we know that UN has come up with 17 sustainable development goals. We can see that zakat fits in many of these goals. Take the case of poverty. Now, when we talk about poverty, the poor person is basically a person who deserves zakat. And when zakat is levied, it is levied to a wealthy person, and the wealthy person is supposed to pay zakat to the poor person. So if we have such a redistribution, then it can help in poverty alleviation. Income transfers to fukara and masakin, which are the important two heads in the distribution or allocation of zakat, would make these fukara and masakin earn enough resources so that they are able to meet their essential needs and even come out of poverty. When we talk about the goal of ending hunger, so basically when we pay zakat to fukara and masakin, these food stipend, these payments enable those poor people to be able to feed themselves and avoid the situation of hunger. When we look at the sustainable development goal of ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being, so we see that when we pay zakat to fukara and masakin, when we pay zakat to those who are poor people, they are going to be able to meet their essential needs and also have uh, at least the basic health standards so that they can be surviving, and they can also work in the labor market to earn incomes. Likewise, if we look at the sustainable development goal, which emphasizes on education, we can see that zakat can be distributed to have scholarships, to build schools, to build infrastructure, and to fund those students who are not able to afford their educational expenses. And then, if we look at the issue of income inequality, zakat is a redistributive institution which tries to redistribute resources from those who have surplus wealth to those who have deficiency of wealth, and it automatically checks income inequality. And if we look at the goal of strengthening the means of implementation and revitalizing the global partnership, we see that if we have zakat institution which is centrally organized, then it can help in not only providing relief to the poorer regions of the particular country, whereas if, let's say, there are countries who are relatively more poor than other countries, you can take the example of Brunei or other countries where poverty is not that high and they have enough surplus zakat resources. So if we have centralized collection, then there can be transfer of zakat to other regions as well, and this can promote the collaborative relationships that we want to see through the sustainable development goals. So zakat is a very important institution in a sense that it is having a very close affinity with some of the sustainable development goals as well. Now, let's look at the Islamic economic framework and see where zakat fits in to the circular flow of economy. So in this circular flow of economy, what we see is that there are households, there are firms, they engage in different kinds of economic exchanges in the resource market, and then they also engage in exchange in the goods market. So households buy goods and services from the goods market, and firms sell these goods and services through the goods market to the households. Now, Islamic banks also come in because they provide asset-backed financing. So there can be asset-backed financing related to consumer goods, where households are provided with financing options so that they can uh, finance the purchase of durable consumer goods, and also Islamic banks can provide financing to the firms as well. Now, where zakat fits into this picture, there is one flow of resources that is based on economic relationships. So when we have trade-based relationship would distribute resources. Households, when they purchase goods in the goods market, they pay price, and firms get this price to then pay the factors of production and also earn some return uh, from the residual amount that they get after paying all the factor payments. But the secondary distribution of resources takes place through the institutions like zakat and also waqf. In this diagram, what we see is that we have secondary redistribution of resources, which is non-market based, and it is coming from households to other households through government, and it is coming from firms to other firms or households through government and also directly as well. So what happens is that when there are different types of households, some poor, some rich, the rich households would pay zakat to those households who are poor. And this way, those households who are poor, who are not able to afford essential goods from the goods market, they are able to have enough purchasing power so that they can meet their essential needs. Now, zakat administration could be through government, and it could also be privately organized. In many of the countries, it is now privately organized, but back in the time of Prophet Muhammad SAW, and after that, we had centralized zakat administration. So what is very important is that here in the circular flow of economy, it's not just that people are able to afford goods in the goods market only if they have something to supply in the resource market in the form of labor, in the form of land, in the form of capital. Those poor people who do not own land, who do not have capital, who also do not have enough skills to be able to get employment, if they remain unemployed, if they remain underserved, if they remain not able to afford the basic essential needs, then the institution of zakat is there, which is going to provide them enough purchasing power so that they are able to meet the essential needs. Now let's move forward and look at another very important thing, which is the issue of how much zakat we can collect in the real world. So we talk about zakat being a very good institution in the sense that it redistributes resources, it helps the poor, but at what scale? What is the significance of that? What is the amount involved that we are talking about when we have zakat based redistribution? So let's do some estimation. This is coming from a study that I did some time back, and it was also presented in Islamic economy workshop in 2016. I am going to present some of the results of that study. And this study is basically looking at the empirical estimation of zakat, how much zakat can be collected. So we have a conceptual discussion about zakat being a very good redistribution resources. It has right filters which can allow the allocation in a targeted and in a very impactful way from the wealth surplus households to the wealth deficient households. But how much zakat we are talking about when we say that zakat has a very significant potential? Now, first of all, we would have to estimate how much wealth zakat can be collected. For that, we would have to look at what are the different heads of zakat which are subject to wealth zakat, like private gold holdings, the amount of cash that people have, the amount of stock investments or other financial investments that they hold, and also the tradable inventory that they possess. So these are some of the heads which are subject to wealth zakat. So through a data-based approach, we estimated the amount that is involved in these heads in about 17 countries, and we took data for 5 years. So we estimated wealth zakat, and for private gold holdings, we used different proxies to come up with a number which can tell us that what is the amount of wealth that is available in the country that can be subject to zakat. And then we also included market capitalization of stocks. So if a person has financial investments, financial instruments, they are also subject to zakat. So we made an estimation of how much zakat can be collected through stocks and other financial investments. And then after that, we had to also incorporate this fact that not everyone owning these resources would be subject to zakat. So we made this assumption that let's take only the people in the top income quintile who are going to be subject to zakat. And in most of the countries, this would be the case. This is even a very conservative estimate. People who are supposed to be paying zakat would be even higher in number than this, but at least those who are in the top income quintile would at least have enough wealth which is equal to the market value of 612 grams of silver. So people who are going to be having this much amount of wealth, which is equal to the nisab value, would be coming in the top income quintile. So taking those people who are in the top income quintile, then we can estimate that what are the number of people who would be paying zakat, and what is the amount of resources that are available in the economy that are subject to zakat. Making these calculations, we can then find out that what will be the amount that can be collected in the form of wealth zakat from different countries in different time periods. Now, when we look at the production zakat, we come across different rates of zakat on production. So it could be 5%, 10%, or 20%, depending on whether the production process intensively uses just one particular factor of production or both factors of production. So output from production process which majorly uses either labor or capital intensive mix of inputs is subject to 10% production value zakat, whereas output from production process which uses both labor as well as capital intensive mix of inputs is subject to 5% production value zakat. Now this is coming from a hadith interpretation where we saw that the rain fed land was subject to ushur, subject to 10% zakat, where labor was provided by the farmer, and the capital in the form of land was coming from the natural resource. It was not paid for. Whereas those lands where the labor as well as capital in the form of irrigated water had to be provided, they were taxed leniently at a 5% rate. So applying this logic to other different types of production that we come across in the real world in contemporary times, we can find out what is going to be the estimated value of production value tax that we can collect. It would be 10% depending on whether the production function only uses one factor of production more intensively and the other factor of production is kept constant. Like in this case, in this function, the first two lines show that k is constant, L is varying, whereas in the second line, L is constant. The bar represents that L is constant and k is varying. So if the production function is going to use one factor of production more intensively than the other, then the rate of zakat is 10%. But if both factors can vary and both factors have to be provided in the production process, in the production function to make output, then the production value tax is lenient at the rate of half of 10% or 5%. So this is the production value tax. So we use this to compute how much production value tax can be collected from different types of land in the agriculture and different types of production that we see in the contemporary times. Now, doing all these calculations, we were able to estimate how much zakat can be collected globally in many of the OIC countries, and we had time series data for the estimated results for different countries from 2010 to 2015. Now, another very important comparison that we did was to look at how much resources are required to meet the poverty gap. So in the very first slide, we saw that if there are 600 million poor people, and if we require $1 a day to feed these people, then the poverty gap or the amount of resources that are required to overcome poverty is 600 million daily. And we can find out the estimate for the per year as well. So this is what these PGI to GDP ratio and PHCR to GDP ratio do. They find out that what is the amount of resources that is required to overcome poverty in a particular country in a particular year. And then we can also find out that what is this amount as a proportion of GDP. What percentage this amount constitute the GDP. So is it 3% of GDP, 2% of GDP, 1% of GDP? We can find out. So I did this calculation, and we had the zakat to GDP ratio, which is coming from the estimation of wealth zakat and production value zakat in different OIC countries. So this is the zakat to GDP ratio. So in different countries, we estimated that from 1% to 4% GDP, zakat to GDP ratio can be seen in the real world. So if we are to collect zakat optimally to its fullest potential, then we can expect that zakat to GDP ratio could be as high as 5% in some countries as well. Now, this is even just a conservative estimate where we are assuming that only the top income quintile uh, is subject to wealth zakat, where we are only accounting for some forms of wealth which are subject to zakat, whereas there are other forms of wealth which are subject to zakat where the data is not easily available. So only few heads of wealth were incorporated to estimate the minimum amount of zakat that can be collected. Now, if we compare the zakat to GDP ratio with PGI, poverty gap index to GDP ratio, and poverty headcount ratio to GDP ratio, what we see is that the amount of resources as a percentage of GDP required to overcome poverty are less than zakat to GDP ratio in many of the OIC countries, which means that if we fully optimize the use of zakat, and if we have very efficient administration of mobilizing zakat as well as allocating zakat, then we can have enough resources to overcome poverty or make a significant dent on poverty and make a significant contribution towards poverty alleviation. So from this table, what we find was that only in Bangladesh, Mozambique, and Nigeria, the zakat to GDP ratio is less than the poverty gap index to GDP ratio, with poverty line defined at $1.25 a day, which means that in all the other countries, the amount of zakat that would be collected would be sufficient to overcome the poverty gap, the amount of resources that are required to overcome the poverty. So it is a very, very promising result, and it shows that significant uh, uh, progress can be made towards poverty alleviation in OIC countries if we fully optimize and utilize the institution of zakat. So we found that even if we change the poverty definition from $1.25 a day to $2 a day, still we found that in many of the countries, the amount of resources that were required to overcome poverty were less than the amount of zakat that could be collected from those OIC countries, which shows that zakat can be used to significantly contribute towards poverty alleviation efforts. Now, another very interesting table was to look at the time series of these zakat to GDP ratios. So, is it constant? Is it just an aberration that in some years the zakat to GDP ratio is very high, whereas in other years it is not the case? We found that no, it is not the case. Relatively stable zakat to GDP ratio were estimated for about 6 years for different OIC countries. So you can see that if we take, let's say, Albania, it was estimated that in 2008, from Albania, we could have zakat to GDP ratio of 2.51%. Now in 2013 as well, it was 2.60%. So it was very near to that. So in many of the countries, we saw that these ratios were quite stable, which means that if we have the institution of zakat, it can be a very stable source of poverty alleviation funding. It is not going to just have effect in 1 year. It could have a very stable impact in a larger period of time. So not only contemporaneous redistribution is possible, but intertemporal redistribution is possible. Not only poverty can be dented at present, but also we can have enough funds for poverty alleviation in the future as well. Another very important thing that we did was to look at what is the effect of or the relationship between zakat to GDP ratio and economic growth rate. So what we found was that the correlation was either negative or weakly positive in most of the countries. So in most of the countries, the amount of zakat that was to be collected was having a negative or a weakly positive correlation with the economic growth rate, which means that zakat can function and it can perform the redistribution role irrespective of the phase of the business cycle. It would not depend on growth. Now, when we have progressive income taxation, what happens is that we are still depending on incomes to be earned first so that we can tax those incomes, tax higher incomes at a higher rate and tax lower incomes at a lower rate. But still, we are relying on income to be increased. We are relying on growth. But the institution of zakat does not depend on that. It has the redistribution function, which is going even acyclically or counter-cyclically. And because the rates of zakat are constant, they can also provide stability in financial planning. And also, we come across this topic of Ricardian equivalence in macroeconomics and also in public finance. So Ricardian equivalence is also going to be possible when you have stable uh, fiscal policy, and that can happen in the institution of zakat, where the rates of zakat are given by the scripture, and there is no tinkering or no change that is made. And because these rates are also very lenient, they also do not hamper economic activities. So we also come across this idea of Laffer curve, which is used in economics, and originally the idea came from Ibn Khaldun. And the idea was that if we tax a particular country at a very high rate, if we tax people of that country at a very high rate, then it is also quite possible that we don't get much taxes. Why? Because we are not providing them the incentive to earn incomes. Why? Because we are taxing them at a very high rate. So imagine you living in a country where the tax rates are marginal tax rates are more than 50%. In that case, you won't have enough incentive to increase your income. So these tax rates that we see, zakat rates that we see, economically speaking, they have a very useful function, that they are not uh, prohibitively high so that they hamper economic activities. They are not very high, 2.5% on wealth, 5 to 10% on production, and that still allows the producer, the income earner, to have enough surplus income so that it can be spent on self-consumption and also for investment, including the social investments, impact investments, including philanthropic spending as well. So we see that zakat is a very important institution. It's not just we saying it through a conceptual talk. We can estimate it, and we can also find that its potential is quite significant, so that we can use it, and we can also incorporate it in our policy making. So what we found from the correlation table between economic growth and zakat to GDP ratio was that the correlation was weak positive or negative, which means that zakat can perform its redistribution role even acyclically or counter cyclically. And because we have this filter that only the person who is having income above nisab is subject to zakat, and the recipient is going to be the person who has wealth uh, below nisab, the redistribution is always going to have 100% achievement in terms of reaching the right targets. So the right targets are reached. Whereas in neoclassical economic policy making, what we find is that initially we don't give credence or importance to taxation. We think of them as creating dead weight losses. And then when we have such discussion of uh, doing taxation so that we can redistribute resources, we can supply public goods, all of that discussion, all of that policy framework is based on ad hoc analysis. There is no compulsion, there is no motivation, no urge from the perspective of a worldview, from the perspective of values, that we have to be uh, having enough resources going for the poor people so that they are able to at least meet their needs. So zakat is a very important institution, and in the circumstances that we are going through right now, where markets are mostly not operating, there is a lockdown kind of a situation in many of the countries. So where markets are not able to provide employment, where the resource markets are stalled, where the goods markets are not working. So in that case, we have to have redistribution. If we are only uh, depending on markets to provide income so that we can feed ourselves, we can afford our essential needs, then there is going to be a problem, because no growth or no economic activity means that those who are wealthy remain wealthy and those who are poor remain poor. And because employment is not generating, in fact, people are getting laid off, people are getting unemployed, then there is going to be a massive problem. So the role of the non-market redistributive institutions like we have zakat is very important in such situations, and we are seeing that in many of the Muslim majority countries, people are generously paying to zakat, and even the weak infrastructure of government is overcome by this philanthropic drive, and people are able to provide for themselves and for their communities. So we see that it's a very important and positive contribution of zakat, and not just in emergency like situations like the one we are facing right now. Even in the policy making, we can incorporate the institution of zakat for contemporaneous and intertemporal redistribution, meaning that not only having the redistribution of resources in the present, but also in the future as well. Why? Because we have seen that zakat to GDP ratio, as estimated from multiple countries using empirical data, is found to be very much stable. So I think I can end my talk here, and then we can discuss few other things in the Q&A.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Salman Ahmed Sheikh, for your insightful talk. So now I want to briefly summarize what has been raised. So Dr. Salman has tried to mention or compare the neoclassical economic approach with the Islamic approach of economics, especially by mentioning from the Maqasid al-Sharia point of view. And in addition to that, he has also compared zakat in the Islamic economy, socio-economy, with the sustainable development goals of United Nations. And lastly, he has presented his empirical estimation of wealth of zakah, and in general, he concluded that zakah is a good or a perfect tool to achieve a sustainable development. So thank you again. Now I'm going to give you the questions collected from YouTube. The first question is, what do you think of the idea to arrange with Islamic banks to establish micro projects using Zakah transfer to the poor? So the mic is yours now.
Yes, the issue sometimes come is that if we are going to use zakat, we also have to follow the rules of zakat allocation. So from the Quran, we get specific heads of zakat where the zakat can be allocated. So one of the rules of zakat says that it would be considered that you have paid zakat when you have made someone the owner of the zakat funds. So in that case, we can use zakat to provide income support or seed capital to micro borrowers, but then it is to be ensured that the financial intermediaries who are paying zakat funds to these beneficiaries, they should be uh, provided with the resource on permanent basis, because if we are just loaning out money, then it is not going to be considered as making someone owner of that money, because when we provide loan, the loan is repayable. So I feel that zakat can be used in terms of providing the seed capital to micro borrowers, and using financial intermediaries is also beneficial in the sense that whenever we have to do intermediation, then there are different problems that arise, like the problem of agency conflict, like the problem of needs, cash flow needs. In that case, financial intermediaries are more suitable in efficiently allocating the resources from those who want to make the resources available to those who are going to be the beneficiaries. So social intermediaries role is also very important, and we can also complement zakat with institutions like waqf as well, which provide a sort of permanency to the administration of funds that flow with the with the philanthropic impulse. So I think that the idea is quite reasonable, but we have to also incorporate this fact that there are certain rules of zakat, and these rules also have to be followed when we are going to be using zakat in a particular intervention strategy or in a particular way of institutionalizing it. But having taken care of these factors, we can definitely use zakat for contemporary development needs.
Okay, thank you. The second question says, basically, Zakah cannot help for proper distribution of resources, because in Quran, Allah mentioned many times that the givers can get back in 10 times, 1,000 times or more. The givers get wealthier even if they pay Zakah. But nothing is said about receivers, whether they will be rich or not after receiving Zakah. So what's your views on this? And I think work can help resource distribution, says one of the participant.
Yes. When we look at the rules of zakat, we find that those who are eligible to receive zakat are also defined. And the threshold value of nisab basically does the filtering so that the zakat funds are reached to the right targets. So if a person owns wealth above the value of nisab, that person is not eligible to receive zakat. So while paying zakat, we also have to ensure that our zakat funds are going to the right recipients who are eligible to receive zakat. And from different hadith, and also from the journal study of Quran and Hadith, what we find is that it is emphasized that we use resources in the best possible manner. Meaning that if we are using some funds for some activity, we should prefer those activities which are going to be more impactful, which are going to also create the social and economic impact. So in this way, I think the social marketing could also be improved in the way zakat institutions work and mobilize zakat funds. For instance, if a school is mobilizing zakat funds so that it could fund the fees of students who are studying in that school. So it is, if it is emphasized that if you pay zakat of let's say 10,000 rupees, it is going to be sufficient to teach 5 students for some number of months, and so on. So if we market our zakat mobilization with the impact, then it could invite more impactful allocation towards those activities which are, even though permissible for zakat, but they are going to have more socio-economic impact. So I feel that here the issue of zakat uh, going towards impactful causes can be solved first through the rule of nisab, which says that only a person who is having a value of wealth below nisab can receive zakat. So that would ensure that zakat goes to the right targets. And then among the eligible recipients, if we mobilize zakat in a way so that we are highlighting the socio-economic impact of post allocation, that if you pay zakat to us as an education institution, your zakat is going to be educating these many number of people. If you are going to be paying zakat to us as a food supplier, then you are going to be feeding these many number of people. Or if you are giving us zakat as a health institution, then we are going to be treating these many number of patients with your zakat funds. So this way, I think a more impactful allocation can be achieved through proper and appropriate social marketing, highlighting the socio-economic impact of such distribution.
Okay. The other question is, if the money is distributed in the economy through zakat, that implies that a lot of money is circulated in the economy. So does it not imply that supply would become less than the demand?
Yeah, the issue is that we have to look at things in a holistic perspective. So zakat is one institution in the Islamic framework. There are other institutions as well. Islam does not say that we cannot trade. Islam does not say that we cannot obtain finance or give finance. It is quite possible that if we have surplus resources, we can invest. We can provide financing to someone. We can engage in equity financing with someone. We can provide karde hasan as well. So these are the different options. What Islam does is that it has a obligatory income which happens through zakat, and then it also encourages that we should try to not just achieve halal, but also strive towards excellence, towards ihsan, meaning that the best is that we pay to others whatever is in excess of our needs. Now, that is reaching the excellence. That is not obligatory that you pay to charity everything that you have in excess, but the excellence is that you do. Excellence is, as Quran says, when you uh, uh, uh, pay to charity what is dearest to you, then basically you are showing the excellence of iman and taqwa. So it means that we have to look at the other institution in the Islamic framework as well. So Islam does not say that you just pay zakat and you cannot earn income. You can earn income, but what Islam does is that it prohibits riba, which is a very, very important source of wealth concentration. Because what riba does is that whatever the unequal distribution of resources that is there in the economy, it would perpetuate it further in the favor of those who are capitalists, who are having enough wealth. Because what they can do is they can invest their wealth at a stipulated rate of interest, and they are going to have not only the protection of level of wealth, but a stipulated increase over that wealth through the institution of riba. So if we have a wealth to income ratio of let's say uh, a given percentage between wealthy and poor in a particular society, it is going to get worsened through the institution of interest, through the institution of riba. So what Islam does is it first of all puts check on wealth concentration by prohibiting riba, and then it levies zakat, so that if you want to retain your wealth holdings, if you want to avoid erosion of wealth, what you can not do is you cannot invest in riba based instruments. And if you don't invest at all, then you would lose through the institution of zakat. So what you have to do is you have to engage in productive enterprise, you have to engage in equity based financing, you have to engage in asset based financing, and you cannot earn return through any other way. You cannot just earn return on money by investing your money in the form of loan. So I think if we look at from the holistic perspective, then Islam allows that we can increase our wealth, but it also emphasizes on excellence as well, that if we have surplus resources, the best way is to pay to charity, best way is to pay to philanthropic causes. But if we want to also invest, we can invest, but in investing we have to ensure that we avoid riba, we always engage in productive enterprise.
Okay. The other question is, it says he wants to ask the source of data, and also want to say that in countries like Nigeria, taking top quinta will lead to underestimation of Zakah. Does it not seem that poverty reduction is more about increasing production, work distribution, skill development, etc., than just redistribution of money?
Yes, through this estimation, what we got was just the amount of zakat that can be collected. Then comes the issue of how we are going to use that zakat. So, for instance, let's say $10 billion amount is going to be received as zakat from a country overall. Now, the allocation is going to be a secondary issue. How we are going to allocate, we can decide. We can decide to allocate it on education, on health, on ending poverty by providing food transfers, by providing cash transfers. And we can also establish institutions which can work towards the benefit of poor. So the allocation can be made more impactful, can be strategized as well. But through this estimation exercise, the idea was to come up with a basic gross minimum estimate so that we can work on that and we can see that what is the potential amount of zakat that can be collected. Regarding the source of the data was taken mostly from World Development Indicators, and the research paper is also available. It was published through a book, and it is also available to be read, to be purchased. It was first presented in Islamic Economy Workshop in 2016. So the proceedings of that conference and also the book that was published later on can be accessed. I can also provide the detailed workings as well, where the methodology as well as the data can be looked at more carefully, and other researchers can also extend this data to other countries and also to more recent years.
Okay, the last question. Are there some examples about Zakah values which paid to establish projects for the poor and needy to change their economic level and not to be poor after some years and be able to pay Zakah to the other poor and continuing this way as a sustainable development?
Yes. So there have been studies done which have looked at the socio-economic impact of zakat, and we have found very impressive results in some of the studies where people who got zakat, they were able to migrate to higher levels of poverty ladder, and they were also able to have socio-economic mobility, exit the poverty pool, and then become non-poor, and then become recipient. As part of this study, I also did one very simple illustration which gave a simulated example that consider that there are two groups of people in an economy. One group which has less number of people but they are wealthy, and there is another group which has more number of people but they are not wealthy, they are poor. Now in such a economy, if let's say we have redistribution through zakat, it could be seen from that simulation that after about 25 to 30 years, the wealth concentration becomes quite low. So we start from 100 plus wealth concentration level, where the wealth multiple of rich is 100 times more than the wealth multiple of poor. But then through the zakat redistribution, after about 25 to 30 years, the wealth multiple just comes in the single digit. So this is also part of that study, and it can be seen. And I also showed that even if we include economic growth into the picture, even if we include uncertainty into the picture, even if we include the fluctuation of income into the picture, which is quite realistic that we do have economic growth occurring at different rates in different parts of the world and in different time periods. Even then, the zakat redistributes resources from the rich to the poor because of the nisab filter, which ensures that zakat necessarily flows from the uh, wealthy individuals to the ones who are poorer. So this can do the redistribution, and from the impact perspective, we can look at the extensive literature that has been developed, which has looked at the effect of zakat on the social well-being of the recipient. Now, I would like to make one small comment as well, that when we are discussing the effect of zakat, it is quite possible that we can still have room for improvement in better zakat allocation, in allocation which increases the societal well-being. So in some places, what happens is that zakat concentrates on, let's say, building mosque, or just funding the education of particular type of institutions. So we can make it better as well. We can make the allocation better as well. That is the human endeavor, how to organize the resources, how to make use of the resources. And in that case, it is quite possible that we find rooms for improvements, we find lessons that we can learn from different parts of the world, from different countries, and we can improve upon our past performance. So that is an area which is going to come in the realm of how do we manage resources, how do we manage public finances, how do we institutionalize the collection as well as the allocation, so that it does not go to waste, it has the maximum impact, and it brings about the socio-economic changes that we want to see.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Salman Ahmed Sheikh, once again on behalf of İSİFAM. Dear participants, please just me, Salman as well. So, dear participants, you can also visit our YouTube channel just to watch different lectures and talks. Especially last week, we had a talk with Professor Asadaman. And next week also at the same time, we're going to have a different talk by Professor Muhammad Anazaka on leveraging philanthropy, microfinance through Waqf and Zakah. Thank you very much, and see you next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.